She was 7 months pregnant, alone in a house full of secrets, married to a man everyone believed was perfect. But behind his polished smile was a betrayal so cruel it could have destroyed not only her heart but her unborn child's future. That night, when Catherine Sterling realized her husband's love had become a weapon, she had only two choices: surrender to the pain or rise from it stronger than anyone expected. What happened next would expose lies, greed, and a truth powerful enough to bring an empire to its knees. This story teaches us that betrayal may break a heart, but it can also awaken a strength no one saw coming. If you believe in justice, resilience, and the power of a woman who refuses to give up, please like this video, leave your thoughts in the comments, share it with someone who needs this message, and subscribe to our channel for more emotional and meaningful stories. This content was carefully researched, developed and manually edited by our team to bring meaningful lessons, emotional value, and inspiration to our audience. And remember, sometimes the people who try to bury you are the same ones who help you discover how deeply your strength was rooted.
Manhattan penthouses are built for silence. Yet in the Sterling home, that quiet felt heavy, almost suffocating. It was a space defined by cold marble, endless glass, and the kind of wealth that kept secrets buried deep beneath imported silk rugs. Catherine Sterling stood at the top of the grand, spiraling staircase, her hand resting on the small of her back. At 7 months pregnant, she felt a profound, golden sense of peace, utterly blind to the fact that her entire reality was currently teetering on the edge of a blade. She believed her life was a testament to love, unaware that the foundation beneath her feet was already splintering into 1,000 jagged, irreparable pieces. Richard, her husband and a titan of industry, stood just inches behind her. The man who had once promised her the stars now spoke in a low, venomous rasp that turned her blood to ice. He did not touch her with love anymore. He held her with a terrifying, calculated pressure. Down in the shadows of the expansive foyer, Vanessa, his mistress, waited with her arms crossed, her lips curled into a predatory smirk that signaled the hunt was over. What happened next was no unfortunate stumble or tragic accident. It was an execution planned down to the very last detail. As the paramedics scrambled to pull Catherine from the wreckage of her life, Vanessa watched, coolly certain that her path to power was finally clear. But Vanessa and the responding officers vastly underestimated the woman they were dealing with. The Sterling penthouse on Park Avenue was far more of a sterile museum than a home, a place Catherine felt she had been hired to curate rather than inhabit. The ceilings stretched so high they seemed to swallow every sound, while the Italian marble floors were polished to a mirror finish, reflecting Catherine's own image back at her, distorted and pale, like a ghost haunting her own life. She had spent 2 years wandering these cavernous rooms, trying to find a corner that actually felt like hers, only to realize that every inch of this palace was designed to keep her contained, monitored, and entirely detached from the world outside. The furniture, the rare abstract art, and the heavy crystal vases were not expressions of her taste, but items chosen by Richard Sterling, the man she had married less than 24 months ago. He referred to it as our home. Yet Catherine always felt like the most expensive, most carefully controlled acquisition on the shelf. Richard was a legend in the world of finance, a man whose stern, handsome face frequently graced the covers of prestige magazines with headlines that sang praises to his ruthless, calculated genius. He was a master of his domain. But as Catherine was beginning to learn, the most dangerous predators are those who look like they belong in a suit, not those who lurk in the dark. To the rest of the world, Richard was the ultimate package: charismatic, impossibly wealthy, and generous to a fault. He had swept Catherine off her feet when she was just a junior curator at a boutique art gallery, a girl who lived in a tiny, drafty apartment and spent her weekends admiring impressionist paintings. Their courtship had been a cinematic whirlwind. He showered her with gifts that made her gasp, flew her to Paris on his private jet, and dropped to one knee under the glittering lights of the Eiffel Tower. It felt like a dream. It felt like the life she had always wanted. She was completely captivated by the version of Richard he curated for the public, unaware of the man lurking beneath. She had fallen hard for the illusion, but the reality of their marriage was a slow, creeping frost. Richard's affection always had a hidden cost. Her closest friends, especially Jessica Riley, her fiercely loyal college roommate, were soon labeled as distractions or social climbers. Richard made sure they were pushed out of her life through a series of subtle, calculated maneuvers. He would schedule meetings during her lunch dates or make dismissive remarks about her friend's character until Catherine felt embarrassed to invite them over. Before she knew it, her social circle had evaporated, leaving her isolated and utterly dependent on the small, lonely orbit of the Sterling household. Even her career, the one thing that had defined her independence, was slowly eroded. He dismissed her passion for art as a quaint hobby, and eventually, with a tone of overwhelming sweetness, persuaded her to quit for the good of their family. A Sterling wife does not work, my love, he would say, framing his control as an act of pure, doting devotion. Your only job is to be my beautiful Catherine. Lately, that sweet facade had hardened into a rigid, invisible cage. The freedom she's once took for granted had been replaced by a life she didn't recognize, where every decision, every movement, and every thought was filtered through the lens of what Richard wanted her to be. He monitored her credit card's spending with the intensity of a forensic accountant, questioning the smallest purchases as if they were acts of betrayal. He installed a high-tech security system throughout the penthouse, and for reasons he claimed were about safety. He was the only one with the administrative access codes. In effect, he had turned their home into a prison. When she called her family, the conversations were awkward and stunted because Richard was always looming nearby, his presence a silent, suffocating warning to keep the topics light and the tone positive. She was being erased, piece by piece, and she was only just beginning to realize how deep the shadows in their home truly went. He is isolating you, Kate. Jessica had warned her during a rare, clandestine lunch just a month ago. An outing Catherine had to plan like a military operation just to slip out of the building. This is not protection, it is possession. Catherine had instinctively rushed to his defense, a reflex born of fear and denial. He is just protective, Jess, she insisted, though her voice wavered. He has had threats before, and the world of high finance is not what you think. You just do not understand the pressures he faces every single day. She wanted so desperately to believe her own excuses, but deep down, the cold truth was already beginning to take root in her mind. But she was starting to understand that world all too well, and the most terrifying facet of it had a name. Vanessa Croft. Vanessa was Richard's protégé at his firm. A woman who possessed raven black hair and eyes as sharp and cold as polished obsidian. Her ambition wasn't just a trait. It was a physical force that radiated from her like heat. Catherine had been forced to meet her at several company galas, and every single time she felt a profound, inexplicable sense of dread. It wasn't just that Vanessa was beautiful. It was the way she looked at Richard as if he were a prize she had already claimed and was simply waiting for the right moment to collect. Vanessa was everything Catherine was not: sleek, predatory, and perfectly at ease in the cutthroat atmosphere Richard inhabited. She would touch his arm when they spoke, her fingers lingering just a heartbeat too long, a subtle claim of intimacy that turned Catherine as stomach. She would look at Catherine, not with the jealousy one might expect, but with a cold, dismissive pity. It was as if she were looking at a placeholder, a temporary occupant of a position she believed was rightfully hers. Catherine was just a bridge between who Richard was and who Vanessa wanted him to be, and she felt like a ghost haunting the very space she was supposed to call her own. The late-night board meetings became an exhausting, relentless routine. Richard would return home smelling faintly of a perfume that certainly didn't belong to Catherine, a sharp, floral scent of jasmine that seemed to cling to the fibers of his custom-tailored suits. When she finally built up the courage to confront him, her voice trembling, he laughed it off with chilling ease. "Darling, you are pregnant and hormonal," he said, his smile never reaching his eyes, turning his face into a flat, plastic mask. He was a master of gaslighting, making her doubt her own senses, her own memory, and her own dignity. "Vanessa is a crucial part of my team," he had insisted, sounding bored by the very suggestion of infidelity. "Are you really going to accuse me of something so pathetic after everything I have given you?" He had a practiced, surgical way of turning her valid fears into evidence of her own ingratitude, leaving her feeling small, foolish, and deeply ashamed of even asking. But then, the discovery of a second phone, tucked deep inside his gym bag, shattered the last fragile fragments of her denial. It was a cold, hard piece of plastic that spoke louder than any of his excuses ever could. The screen lit up with a single, damning message from V. It read, "He cannot wait to be rid of her. The prenup is the only thing stopping him." But not for long. The prenup. Catherine had barely glanced at the document when they married, so blinded by the intensity of his courtship and her own naive trust. Her own lawyer had urged her to be careful, but Richard had been so incredibly, masterfully persuasive, framing the legal document as a mere formality intended to protect his business interests for the sake of their future children. Now, she realized the only person he was protecting was himself. The memory of his smooth, practiced words now chilled her to the marrow. She had retrieved the document from the back of their safe, her hands shaking so violently she could barely hold the paper. The clauses were ironclad, designed with a ruthless efficiency. In the event of a divorce initiated before the birth of their child, she would walk away with a measly, insulting sum that wouldn't last a year in the city. However, if a child was born of the marriage, a massive trust would be established for the heir, and her settlement would jump into the tens of millions. The math was simple, and it was absolutely sickening. Their son, who was currently kicking gently against her ribs, was not a symbol of their love to Richard. He was a financial liability, a multi-million-dollar problem he needed to solve. Before he could officially end the marriage, that evening, the air in the penthouse was thick with the weight of unspoken tension. Richard was hosting a small, impromptu gathering for some of his wealthiest investors, and he was acting as if nothing were wrong, sipping vintage scotch with a relaxed, predatory confidence that made Catherine's skin crawl. He had insisted she wear a tight silk sheath dress, one that she felt was unflattering to her 7-month bump, but he waved away her discomfort with a cold flick of his wrist. "I want to show off my two most precious assets," he had purred, one hand resting on her belly, the other firmly on her back. The touch felt like a burning brand, a mark of ownership rather than affection. During the party, she saw Vanessa arrive uninvited, walking into the room with the casual, dangerous grace of someone who knew exactly where she belonged. She glided into the room, a vision in a crimson dress, and made a direct line for Richard. Catherine watched them from across the crowded living room, a heavy knot of ice forming in the pit of her stomach. She saw the shared glances, the hushed, conspiratorial whispers that clearly excluded everyone else in the room. At one point, Vanessa's eyes met hers across the sea of guests, and the woman offered a slow, deliberate, and truly terrifying smile. It wasn't a smile of friendship. It was a declaration of war, and Catherine finally realized she was entirely outmatched. It was the smile of a victor who had already won the game. When the last guest had finally departed, the silence that descended upon the penthouse was heavier and more deafening than any sound Catherine had ever heard. The staff had been dismissed for the night, leaving them alone. Vanessa stood by the massive floor-to-ceiling window, looking out over the glittering city lights, a glass of champagne in her hand, the very picture of arrogant, unchecked entitlement. Catherine knew she could not live this suffocating lie for one more moment. Her baby's life and her own depended entirely on her finding the courage to fight back. "Richard," she began, her voice steadier than she ever thought possible. "We need to talk." He turned from the bar, his expression one of weary, practiced indulgence, as if he were listening to a child complain about a toy. "Catherine, it has been a long night." He sighed. "I know about the phone." "Richard," she stated clearly, the words hanging in the air like a blade. "I know about Vanessa." The mask of the charming, devoted husband dropped instantly, replaced by a cold, flat emptiness that truly terrified her. He did not deny it. He did not even try. He simply looked at her as if she were a piece of furniture he was tired of owning, a discarded object he no longer cared to keep. "So, you have been snooping," he said, his voice dropping to a dangerously low, rhythmic register. How disappointing. It was the lack of shock that hurt the most. He hadn't been caught, he had simply been exposed. And he clearly didn't care who saw the real man behind the brand. "I want a divorce," Catherine said, the words tasting like bitter ash in her mouth. She clutched her belly, a primal, overwhelming need to protect her unborn son washing over her. Richard laughed, a harsh, ugly sound that echoed through the vast, empty room. "A divorce. Do not be stupid. Catherine, you will get nothing. You will be back in your tiny apartment with nothing to show for your time as Mrs. Sterling. Read your prenup again." He was mocking her, knowing exactly how trapped she was by the paper he had forced her to sign. "I have," she shot back, a spark of genuine, white-hot defiance flaring within her. "And I know that changes once our son is born." That was her mistake. The moment the words left her lips, she saw a flicker of something dark and ancient in his eyes. It was not simple anger. It was a cold, chilling calculation, a terrifying clarity that made her step back. He glanced over at Vanessa, who had been watching the entire exchange with detached, cruel amusement, and Catherine realized with a sickening jolt that she was not just in a failing marriage. She was in a fight for her very survival. Vanessa offered a faint, chilling nod that barely moved her chin. But it was enough. It was a green light. "You are right," Richard murmured, his tone shifting into something terrifyingly smooth and soft as he began to drift toward her. "Things change. We really cannot have that. Can we?" He began backing her toward the edge of the grand staircase, the crown jewel of their freezing, massive home. His eyes remained locked onto hers with the predatory focus of a hawk tracking its prey. Every frantic step she took backward felt like she was retreating into a corner of her own existence she no longer recognized. The air thinned, making each breath a struggle as his shadow stretched large and dark against the polished wood. The staircase was his obsession, a sweeping, triple-story structure of high-gloss mahogany and cold steels that spiraled down like a frozen cage. "Richard, what are you doing?" she gasped, her heart drumming against her ribs like a bird trapped in a glass jar. She retreated, her heel clipping the very edge of the top step. He was right there now, his features a hard mask of unyielding, lethal resolve. She could feel the house itself humming beneath her feet. A silent, unfeeling witness to the violence she was finally beginning to understand. Her mind raced, clawing for an exit, but he had systematically blocked every path to safety, leaving her stranded at the jagged edge of the world, just fixing a small problem. "My love," he said. He reached out, his hands pinning her shoulders with a grip that felt like solid iron. She looked past him, her eyes meeting Vanessa standing in the foyer below. The smirk was gone, replaced by a look of ravenous, hungry anticipation. Vanessa raised her champagne flute in a silent, mocking toast in that horrific, crystal clear moment. Catherine understood everything about her fate. The betrayal sliced deeper than any blade. Cold and sharp, she realized this was never about some petty disagreement. It was a calculated, cold-blooded elimination. A final move in a high-stakes game she had not known she was playing until the very last second. This was not merely about a divorce or a fight over money. This was an eradication, please, she begged, hot tears streaming down her pale face. "Please, not the baby. Richard's cold." Thin smile was the final thing she saw. He was the whole point. Catherine. And then he shoved her. The world became a nauseating, terrifying blur of motion. For one heartbeat, there was total weightlessness, a sickening void where the solid floor had been. Time seemed to freeze, suspended in the space between the high ceiling and the hard ground, as the reality of his profound hatred finally hit her harder than his physical force ever could. Then gravity reclaimed her with brutal, crushing force. Catherine's desperate shriek was swallowed by the cavernous room as her body tumbled down the merciless, unforgiving mahogany steps. Each impact felt like a starburst of agony. Her head struck a baluster, the sound a sickening, hollow crack in the quiet, opulent penthouse. Her shoulder slammed into a step, her arm twisting at an unnatural, jagged angle. She was helpless. A doll dropped by a cruel hand, falling through a nightmare that felt as if it would never end. The sheer speed of her descent was dizzying, this leaving no chance to brace for the bone-shattering collision waiting at the bottom. Her last flicker of consciousness was a desperate, silent prayer for her unborn son as a final, crushing impact against the cold marble floor below stole her breath and plunged her into an abyss of nothingness. Down in the foyer, Vanessa Croft did not flinch. She took a slow, deliberate sip of her expensive champagne, her dark eyes fixed on the crumpled, broken form at the base of the stairs. She was waiting for the silence to return, for the house to reclaim its stillness. She did not look away. She watched the absolute stillness of the body with a clinical detachment that would have terrified anyone else, feeling only a sharp, biting sense of victory. The sight of Catherine's broken body, a dark halo of hair splayed across the white marble, did not evoke a shred of pity. It was the satisfying conclusion to a masterfully executed plan. This was her grand prize, the man, the massive fortune, and the high society life she had finally claimed for herself. Above, Richard Sterling stood at the summit of the stairs, his breathing slightly jagged, not from any physical exertion, but from the raw, intoxicating adrenaline of a predator that had just successfully made a kill. He looked down at the scene below, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird, savoring the outcome of their dangerous little game. He peered down, his face a perfectly blank mask in the dim, golden light. He ran a hand through his perfectly styled hair, his mind already pivoting from the act itself to the elaborate, necessary performance that had to begin now. He smoothed his jacket, composed his features into a picture of pure shock and horror, and then let out a gut-wrenching cry. Catherine. His shout was a masterpiece of fabricated despair, a loud, echoing sound designed to pierce the air and establish his innocence. He had rehearsed this moment in his mind for weeks, and now, he had to deliver the performance of a lifetime to ensure no one would ever suspect his role in what had just occurred. He thundered down the stairs, carefully skirting the perimeter of his wife's broken body before he finally discovered her. He dropped to his knees, his movements theatrical and exaggerated. "Oh my God, no, Kate, baby, can you hear me?" He touched her cheek, recoiling instantly as if her skin were red-hot embers. He looked up at Vanessa, his eyes wide with a perfectly acted panic. "Call 911 now." He needed to make sure the neighbors heard the urgency, that the recording of the call would document his frantic state. Every gesture was a cold, calculated maneuver designed to distance himself from the violence he had just unleashed upon the woman who loved him. Vanessa, playing her part with chilling precision, fumbled for her phone with hands that were perfectly, dangerously steady. Her voice, when she spoke to the dispatcher, was a pitch-perfect imitation of a terrified, gasping witness. "Yes, my friend. She fell. She is pregnant. Oh God, there is so much blood. Please hurry. We are at 740 Park Avenue, the penthouse." While she spoke, Richard began the second phase of his deception, contaminating the scene under the guise of rendering aid. He looked down at his wife, praying she would not regain consciousness long enough to utter a single, incriminating word that could unravel the web of lies they had woven. He gently cradled Catherine's head, his fingers subtly wiping away any trace evidence he might have left on her shoulders or clothes. He pulled her dress down, adjusting it to seem like a tragic, clumsy fall rather than a violent, intentional act. Every touch was calculated, every movement designed to blur the truth and frame the incident as a pathetic, accidental stumble. He was careful not to leave any bruises on her wrists that might hint at a struggle. He wiped his palms on his trousers, checking to see if he had any blood on his cuffs. He was a master of his environment, leaving absolutely nothing to chance as he waited for the authorities. The wail of sirens grew from a faint, distant cry to an overwhelming, rhythmic roar that filled the opulent street below. Within minutes, the penthouse, usually a sanctuary of undisturbed wealth, was swarming with the urgent, chaotic energy of paramedics and police officers. The medical team descended on Catherine's still form, their movements efficient and professional. Richard watched them with a hollow, haunted look in his eyes, successfully playing the role of the devoted, shattered husband. He knew the police would be looking for flaws in his narrative, so he kept his head bowed, sobbing quietly into his hands, letting the chaos mask his utter lack of real grief. They cut away the silk dress, attached a neck brace, and began shouting out medical jargon that sounded like a foreign language in this world of luxury. No response to verbal or painful stimuli. Blood pressure is dropping. Possible severe head trauma and internal bleeding. Richard hovered over them, the picture of a distraught husband losing his entire world. He felt a cold shiver of fear, not for her life, but for the possibility that she might wake up and talk. He needed them to be fast, but he also needed them to see he was doing everything in his power to keep her alive, a man desperate for any shred of hope. "Is she okay? What about the baby? You have to save the baby," he wailed, allowing real tears born of extreme, selfish stress rather than grief to stream down his face. As the paramedics worked, 2 uniformed officers began to secure the perimeter. They were soon joined by a man in a rumpled, tan trench coat who moved with a quiet, grounded authority that set him apart from the frantic energy of the paramedics. He stood near the entrance, observing the room with a calm, analytical gaze. He did not seem impressed by the wealth of the penthouse. He seemed only interested in the facts, his eyes searching the perimeter for anything that felt out of place. Detective Michael Corian of the 19th Precinct had the weary, knowing eyes of a man who had seen the worst of the city, from its grittiest alleys to its most gilded cages. He knew that tragedy did not discriminate by zip code, but that extreme wealth often complicated the truth. Corian's gaze swept the scene, taking it all in: the magnificent staircase, the victim heavily pregnant, being loaded onto a gurney, and the shattered champagne flute near the bottom of the stairs, which struck him as distinctly odd. He did not like the way the glass had broken. It didn't look like it had fallen from a hand. It looked like it had been thrown, a small jarring detail that sat heavily in his mind. Who carries a delicate crystal flute while descending a grand staircase? Detective Corian studied the scene with a cold, analytical precision. He observed Richard Sterling, a man whose public reputation for business brilliance now seemed overshadowed by a frantic, performative grief. Then his gaze drifted to Vanessa Croft. Perched near the window, she appeared pale and shaken. Yes, but Corian noted her eyes were bone dry. "I am Detective Corian," he rasped, his voice low and gravelly. "Can one of you tell me what happened?" He stared them down, waiting for the first hairline fracture in their composure. He knew this type well. Men who believed their vast fortune could purchase a custom reality, and women willing to help them build it. He was not going to let them succeed. "Can one of you tell me what happened?" Richard immediately launched into a polished, rehearsed narrative, his voice thick with performative sobs. "We were simply talking at the top of the stairs," he choked out. She was so incredibly upset. Clearly hormonal. You know how these things go. She turned around far too fast. Her heel caught on the edge and she tumbled. It all happened in a heartbeat. I tried to reach out, to grab her, but I missed. He gestured wildly with his hands. His body language crafted to project the image of a man burdened by crushing guilt and profound regret. He was performing, and he knew exactly how to play the victim. He waited for Corian to nod, to accept the lie, but the detective just kept staring, his face an unreadable, skeptical mask. He held out a hand, showcasing the scrapes on his knuckles as if they were prestigious trophies, his eyes desperate for even a shred of pity. Corian remained as still as a statue. In his long, brutal career, he had heard 1,000 variations of this exact story. Some were raw and honest, but most were carefully constructed fictions designed to avoid a prison sentence. Turning away from the husband, he fixed his gaze on the woman standing nearby. "And you are, ma'am?" he asked, his tone intentionally neutral. "Vanessa Croft," she replied, her voice smooth and steady, perhaps a little too steady for someone who had just witnessed a friend suffer such a horrific, life-threatening accident. "I am a colleague of Richard," she added. "I was just heading out when it happened." It was exactly as he said, a terrible fall. She offered a soft, rehearsed smile, but Corian felt a sudden, sharp, cold prick of intuition. She was lying. Corian gave a slow, deliberate nod, letting his gaze linger on her for a heartbeat longer than necessary before walking toward the staircase. He crouched down on the cool marble, his eyes scanning the floor for any subtle sign of the truth. He spotted a tiny smeared drop of blood, a few faint scuff marks, and the general disorder of the scene. But his gut, that finely honed instrument of professional skepticism, was already buzzing with warning signals. An accidental fall was mathematically possible, sure, but the sheer height of the stairs and the sheer brutality of the injuries felt excessive. This felt like rage. He studied the sharp, unforgiving angle of the marble steps again, mentally mapping the trajectory of a falling body. It simply did not add up. The position of her body felt staged, like a mannequin placed by someone who did not understand physics. An accidental fall was possible, but the sheer height and the brutality of the injuries felt excessive. It felt angry, calculated, and deeply personal. As the paramedics finally wheeled Catherine out of the penthouse, her face deathly pale, her body limp, a breathing tube snaking down her throat, Richard made a dramatic, desperate show of trying to follow them. "I have to be with her," he shouted, reaching out toward the gurney. Corian stepped in, placing a gentle but firm hand on his arm to stop him. "Sir, they need space to work," he said calmly. "We need your formal statement while the details are still fresh. We will get you to the hospital as soon as we finish here." It was standard procedure, but also a tactical test. A truly distraught husband would fight him. Richard, after one brief moment of performative resistance, immediately acquiesced. That was the first red flag. "We need your statement here while it is fresh. We will get you to the hospital as soon as we are done." It was standard procedure, but also a clever test. A truly distraught husband would scream, would fight to be with his wife. But Richard, after a single moment of performative resistance, gave in. That was the first red flag in a long list of them. The penthouse had transformed into a crime scene, and Corian was starting to see the jagged edges of a much darker story beginning to emerge from the shadows. He signaled for his team to bag the champagne glass from the table, his eyes narrow and intensely focused. He knew they were hiding something significant, and he was determined to spend every waking hour figuring out exactly what that was. Forensic teams began their methodical work, dusting every surface for prints, snapping hundreds of photographs, and carefully collecting tiny fibers from the high-pile carpet. Corian led Richard and Vanessa to a separate sitting room, a cold, impersonal space filled with stiff, expensive white leather furniture. He chose to interview them separately. Richard's story was polished, full of emotional detail about their supposed deep love, their excitement for the baby, and Catherine's recent, alleged emotional instability. He painted a vivid picture of a fragile, hysterical pregnant woman prone to sudden dizzy spells. It was a classic deflection tactic, shifting the blame onto the victim's own health. Corian took notes, his pen moving steadily across the pad, while he watched Richard's eyes for any sign of hesitation. He painted a picture of a fragile, emotional pregnant woman prone to dizzy spells. Vanessa's story arrived as a perfect echo of Richard's clean, concise and chillingly similar corroboration. She added a deliberate, calculated touch of sorrow, mentioning how excited Catherine had seemed just a few hours earlier. It was almost too perfect, too rehearsed. Corian listened to her describe the events with a level of clinical detail that seemed impossible for someone who was supposedly in deep shock. He began to wonder if they had practiced these specific lines together in private. He stood up and began to pace the room, his shadow stretching long across the floor, feeling the tension in the air thicken like a heavy, suffocating storm waiting to finally break. But Corian eventually found the tiny chinks in the armor, a housekeeper, interviewed briefly before being sent home for the night, mentioned that Mrs. Sterling never wore heels in the house, especially not during her pregnancy. She always wore a specific brand of expensive, comfortable flats. Yet, a single stiletto-heeled shoe lay on the landing halfway up the stairs, as if placed there to make the story stick. The other was nowhere to be found. It was a glaring, obvious inconsistency. Why would she be wearing high heels? Corian made a sharp note in his pad, his mind working through the implications. Someone had planted that shoe to sell a lie. He just had to find the proof to show exactly who was behind this twisted performance. The other was nowhere to be found. Furthermore, a patrol officer noted something curious to Corian. "Detective, look at the husband's watch," he whispered. "It is a high-end smart watch, but the glass screen is shattered." Corian approached Richard once more. "Mr. Sterling, what happened to your watch?" Richard looked down, feigning sudden, breathless surprise. "Oh my God. It must have happened when I fell to my knees beside her," he said, his voice trembling perfectly. "I did not even notice it. It was a plausible lie, the kind that might work on a gullible juror. But Corian knew those luxury watches were built to be incredibly tough. A crack like that required a significant, direct impact, an impact like striking something or someone with force, rather than just hitting a marble floor. It was a plausible lie, but Corian knew those watches were built to be tough. A crack like that required a significant, direct impact, an impact like perhaps striking something or someone with immense force. As the sun began to rise, casting long, orange shadows across the city, Detective Corian stood by the window of the penthouse, looking down at the awakening metropolis. He felt the weight of the city, the millions of secrets buried in the concrete below. He was not just looking at a room anymore. He was looking at a stage where a performance had been enacted, and he was the only one in the audience who realized that the entire play was a complete and utter fraud. He had a victim in critical condition at New York Presbyterian, a baby's life hanging in the balance, a powerful, grieving husband, and a cool-as-ice witness. Everything on the surface screamed accident, but every instinct in his gut screamed murder. He did not have proof yet. He did not have a clear motive, but he had a deep, gnawing suspicion that would not go away. And for Michael Corian, that was always the beginning. The truth was in this penthouse somewhere, and he was going to tear the place apart until he found it. No matter how much money or influence stood in his way, he knew that the truth, no matter how deeply buried, always had a way of surfacing. And for Michael Corian, that was always the beginning. The truth was in this penthouse somewhere, and he was going to tear the place apart until he found it. The days that followed the fall were a carefully orchestrated performance by Richard Sterling. He was the very image of the grieving husband, maintaining a constant, watchful vigil at the hospital, never leaving her side for long. He played the part so well that even the hardened nurses started to feel genuine pity for him. He was building his alibi, layer by layer, ensuring that no one would ever suspect that the man sitting by her bed was the same man who had pushed her. His face was etched with worry for the reporters who camped outside the hospital entrance. He gave a tearful, shaky interview to a local news station, his voice cracking as he asked for prayers for his beloved Kate and their unborn son. He received an outpouring of public sympathy. Flowers and condolence cards flooded the hospital lobby. To the world, Richard Sterling was a man suffering an unimaginable tragedy, a hero trying to stay strong for his wife. But behind the closed doors of her hospital room, Richard wasn't praying. He was watching the heart monitor, waiting for the moment he could be sure she would never wake up to tell the truth. Detective Michael Corian was not buying the performance. He saw the grief-stricken husband act for exactly what it was, a clever, hollow smokescreen meant to fool the cameras. At the 19th precinct, he and his dedicated team began to systematically deconstruct the carefully curated narrative Richard had spent years building. The investigation was a quiet, methodical grind, a search for that one frayed, loose thread that would unravel the entire tapestry of his lies. He combed through encrypted phone records, private banks' statements, and uncomfortable employee interviews, desperate for anything that contradicted the fairy tale of a perfect, happy marriage. He knew that men like Richard Sterling were arrogant. They made mistakes because they were too blind to hide them. He just had to be patient enough to catch them in the act. "Let us start with the real motive," Corian said to his team, his hand tapping a whiteboard covered with high-resolution photos of the penthouse. Catherine, Richard, and his mistress, Vanessa. He keeps insisting they were happy. Let us find out how happy they really were behind those closed doors. They dug deep into the Sterling lifestyle, and what they unearthed was a far cry from the polished life portrayed in the media. They found evidence of secret bank accounts, questionable offshore investments, and a series of explosive, violent arguments that had been kept well hidden from the public eye. It was becoming clear that Richard had every reason to want Catherine gone, and he had been meticulously planning her destruction for months, right under everyone's noses. Financial records revealed a harsh, unsettling reality. Catherine had once been an independent woman with a thriving career of her own, but those days were long buried. She had become completely dependent on Richard, systematically stripped of her autonomy and her spirit. Her personal bank accounts had been quietly closed by the firm, and she was forced to rely on a single, secondary credit card with a strict, humiliating spending limit. Every single transaction she made was tracked by the company's internal auditors, with instant digital notifications sent directly to Richard's personal account, ensuring she was under his constant, suffocating surveillance every second of the day. She was living in a luxury prison, and he held every single key to her life. This was not the conduct of a loving or trusting husband. It was the clinical, calculated behavior of a master controller. Investigators soon tracked down Jessica Riley, Catherine's best friend and confidant. She arrived at the station with eyes red-rimmed from endless crying and a blazing fury that Detective Corian found refreshing after the sterile, fake tears of Richard, an accident. "That is absolute garbage," she spat out, her voice trembling with raw, unfiltered rage. She knew exactly who Richard was, and she was done playing nice to protect his image. She began to spill the truth about the fear Catherine lived in, her words cutting through the silence of the room like a knife, painting a portrait of a woman who was desperate to survive her own marriage. Richard looked like a hero to the public, but to Catherine, he was a cold-blooded monster. She lived as a prisoner in their sprawling, cold-glass mansion, terrified of his reach, and his influence was everywhere. 2 weeks before the fall, she had risked everything to contact Jessica using a hidden burner phone. That thin, cheap piece of plastic was the massive break Detective Corian had been hunting for. When Jessica pulled that crumpled, desperate note from her purse, the investigation finally caught fire. It was the first tangible proof that Catherine was planning an escape. She had been living in a state of constant, heightened terror, waiting for the right moment to break free from his grasp. And now the police finally had the leverage they needed to tear his world apart. Jessica had kept that burner number for emergencies, acting as Catherine's only lifeline in a world where she was watched by cameras and bodyguards. She told the investigators that Richard tracked every move she made, read her private messages, and even bugged her calls. Catherine had been desperately plotting an escape, waiting only for the baby to arrive before fleeing for good. She knew their prenup was a cage specifically designed to hold her and her inheritance hostage. Jessica's testimony was the catalyst, giving Corian the one missing piece of the puzzle, a clear, undeniable motive for the crime. It was no longer a mystery. It was a race against time to ensure that Richard Sterling would finally face the consequences of the nightmare he had created. The district attorney moved fast, securing the prenuptial agreement for a deep dive. It was exactly as Jessica had feared. If they divorced before the baby was born, Catherine would be left with absolutely nothing, abandoned and broke. But once the child arrived, the contract shifted, granting her full financial security for both herself and the infant. Richard had no intention of letting that happen. He wanted a clean slate, total freedom from any marital or financial ties, and he was clearly willing to kill to ensure he kept his fortune intact. He viewed his wife and his unborn son as obstacles to be removed, and his cold, calculating mind had turned toward the most permanent solution possible. The legal documents proved he had everything to gain from her death. Killing Catherine before the birth solved every single one of his problems in a single, brutal stroke if the child died as well. His financial slate would be perfectly, cleanly wiped. Corian and his team doubled down. Armed with this terrifying new theory, they secured another warrant to sweep the penthouse with a fine-toothed comb, looking for the physical proof they needed. They were not just searching for that elusive burner phone, but for any evidence that proved Catherine had been planning to walk out on her powerful, manipulative husband. They needed to show the jury that this was not a tragic, accidental fall, but a premeditated execution by a man who had decided his wife's life was worth less than his bank account balance. The burner phone remained missing, but the forensics team stumbled upon something Richard and his mistress, Vanessa, had been far too arrogant to notice. The penthouse was a high-end smart home, rigged with voice-activated assistants and hidden security cameras in every room. Richard had absolute control over the system and assumed he had successfully scrubbed every trace of data from the cloud servers. He thought he was untouchable because of his money and his status, but his vanity had left a digital trail that he could never truly erase. He had forgotten that smart technology does not always listen to the master. Sometimes, it records the truth when no one is watching, holding on to fragments of data that eventually surface to bury the guilty. He had deactivated the foyer cameras before the party, claiming it was for the privacy of his guests. But he had forgotten about a small, unassuming smart speaker sitting on a console in the living room. It was tucked away, out of sight, but it caught everything happening in the main area of the house. A tech-savvy detective on the team managed to bypass the encryption, salvaging audio fragments from the cloud that were meant to be overwritten but stayed hidden in the server's cache. It was a digital ghost, a silent witness waiting to be found and brought into the light. Corian listened as the team recovered the file, knowing that this single, forgotten device was about to become the final nail in the coffin for the Sterling Empire. The team spent hours filtering out the background noise of the party, the clinking of champagne glasses, and distant, hollow laughter until they finally found it. The recording from the exact seconds leading to the fall. The audio was muffled, but the voices were unmistakable. "Catherine, I know about the phone," Richard said, his voice hard as iron. "I know about Vanessa." Richard responded with a cold, mocking laugh, saying, "So you have been snooping. How incredibly disappointing," he sneered, his tone dripping with the kind of disdain that only a man who views his wife as an object could possess. It was the sound of a predator cornering his prey, confirming every fear Jessica had voiced during her testimony. Catherine insisted that she wanted a divorce, but Richard just laughed at her, telling her not to be stupid and to read the prenup terms again. Catherine countered that she had read it, and she knew the terms changed the moment their son was born. A new, icy female voice cut in. It was Vanessa. "She knows you have to handle it." Richard replied. "We cannot have that, can we?" The mic picked up his heavy footsteps. Catherine's muffled, frantic plea, then a sickening, hollow thud that echoed through the small room. The recording captured the entire struggle, a chilling sound that made even the most hardened detectives in the room recoil from the sheer cruelty of the moment. It was a death sentence caught on a piece of plastic. It was all there, a brutal murder preserved in a digital echo. Corian felt a grim sense of triumph wash over him as the final pieces snapped into place. Simultaneously, the medical reports arrived from the hospital. Catherine's injuries were completely inconsistent with a simple, tragic fall. The coroner had noted deep, symmetrical bruising on her shoulders, the unmistakable signature left by fingers gripping and shoving with immense, focused, and malicious force. The evidence was shifting from a sad, freak accident into a calculated, cold-blooded execution that had been carried out in the middle of a social gathering. There was no longer any room for doubt. Richard Sterling had crossed the line from a manipulative husband into a murderer. Even Richard S. Watch told a damning story. The crack on the expensive screen had been carefully analyzed, and microscopic silk fibers from Catherine S. dress were found embedded in the glass. He had not fallen, as he had lied to the police. He had cracked the screen when his arm swung forward with lethal force to push her into the void. Corian now had the motive. A solid timeline, the physical forensic evidence, and an audio confession that would stand up in any courtroom. The walls were closing in on Richard Sterling and his partner in crime, Vanessa. There was nowhere left for them to run, and the justice they thought they had escaped was finally coming to find them. Heavy and absolute. He had them trapped. Corian felt that familiar, icy thrill as the case locked into place. All he needed was his star witness. But she was currently lying in a hospital bed, lost to the world, a machine doing the breathing for her. He paid a quiet, somber visit to the intensive care unit to see the situation for himself. Standing outside the glass, he watched the scene unfold, knowing that the man responsible was currently putting on the performance of a lifetime for the nurses and the press. Richard sat there, looking like the grieving husband, but Corian saw the truth of the monster behind the mask. He was waiting, watching for the moment he could finally be free of the consequences of his actions. Through the glass, he watched Richard sitting by the bedside, clutching her hand, his face a perfect, practiced mask of grief for the nurses to see. He was whispering to her. Corian strained to read his lips. "Just die," Richard whispered. "Please just die." The doctor's outlook was grim. Catherine had suffered a devastating, traumatic brain injury, and she was effectively suspended in a state of living death, unable to wake or respond to the world around her. It was a scene of pure, chilling malice. A man whispering his desire for his wife's death while pretending to love her. Corian had to hold himself back from storming into the room and arresting him on the spot. But he knew he had to wait for the right moment. If she ever regained consciousness, her memory would likely be shattered, if she could function at all. The baby, however, was a fighter. His heart was strong, monitored constantly by the neonatal team. He was the ticking clock in the room, the only thing keeping Richard from his perfect, clean slate. As long as the baby remained unborn, Richard's problem was not fully solved. Corian knew he had enough to make an arrest, and the district attorney was ready to move. But the timing was delicate and incredibly risky. They needed Catherine to be the one to speak, to hold him accountable for the life he tried to steal. And until she could, they had to move with the precision of a surgeon to ensure he did not escape justice. A high-priced defense attorney could easily manipulate a jury, painting the audio as a misunderstanding and the other evidence as circumstantial or misinterpreted. The missing piece, the one thing that would make the case bulletproof and guarantee a conviction, was for Catherine Sterling to wake up and point her finger directly at the man currently sitting by her side. That was the only path to absolute justice. And Corian prayed for a miracle every single day. He knew the odds were against them, but in his years of police work, he had seen people come back from the brink before. He just hoped that Catherine had the strength left in her to come back and tell the world exactly who the man she married really was. Standing there watching the predator comfort his prey, Corian made a silent, solemn vow. He would get justice for her, whether she woke up or not. But he desperately hoped she would return to them to be the voice against her husband. The city was currently pitying a monster, and only Catherine held the key to revealing his true, dark face to the public. Life slowly began to return to Catherine, not in a rush but in faint, distant whispers that felt like they took an eternity to reach her. It was a flicker in the dark, a sign that the woman Richard had tried to discard was still fighting to stay alive, and Corian felt a renewed sense of purpose in his long, difficult quest for the truth. She had been drifting in a thick, soundless fog, a place completely devoid of thought or feeling. Then, very gradually, sensations began to bleed through the gray. The rhythmic, metronomic beep of the life support machine, the sterile, biting scent of medical antiseptic, the painful dry scratch of the tube in her throat, the dull, throbbing ache that seemed to radiate from every single bone in her broken, battered body as she lay there. She felt like she was trapped in a deep, underwater well, trying to claw her way up to the surface. It was dark, it was heavy, and it was terrifying. But for the first time since the fall, she felt a small flicker of consciousness trying to break through the endless, suffocating silence of her own broken mind. Distant voices filtered through the heavy, liquid darkness, sounding like muffled shouts from beneath a vast, cold ocean. A soft feminine voice explained complex medical jargon she could barely process, followed by a clinical detached male tone delivering a grim prognosis. But then, a voice she knew all too well cut through the thick fog, pulling her back to the surface. It was Richard. He was asking if there was any change, his tone heavy with an impatience that made the air feel thin. He wanted to know if she might really remain in this vegetative state for weeks or even months on end. His words were tight, jagged with an anxiety that Catherine, even through her semi-conscious stupor, recognized as thinly veiled irritation rather than genuine concern. "Mr. Sterling, your wife has suffered a massive neurological trauma," the doctor replied, his tone tinged with a weary, professional sympathy. "We have to be realistic about the path ahead and what the next few months might demand for her recovery." It was a freezing reality that made her heart sink deep into her chest, even as she lay there utterly motionless, trapped behind the heavy, iron-bound gates of her own failing body. "The best we can do is simply wait and hope," the doctor added, "wait and hope." The words echoed in the fragile, emerging clarity of Catherine S. mind. She fought to pry her eyes open, but her lids felt as though they were fused shut with molten lead. She tried to twitch even a single finger to signal that she was there, that she could hear their betrayal, but her physical form remained a silent, useless prison. She was held captive inside a living nightmare that she knew she could not escape unless she found a way to bridge the distance between her mind and her muscles. A cold, razor-sharp panic began to bloom within her. Days bled into one another in a blurred haze of physical pain and agonizing paralysis. She learned to identify the nurses by the rhythm of their footsteps and the gentle, practiced touch of their hands. She felt the cool, slick gel on her stomach during the routine ultrasound, and her spirit soared whenever she heard the strong, steady thump of her son's heartbeat. He was her only anchor, the heartbeat that gave her a reason to claw her way back from the dark, cold abyss that threatened to claim her. He was alive. That single, beautiful truth was her lifeline, a desperate reason to struggle back toward the light. She eventually learned to read the shifting atmosphere of the room like a predator stalking its prey. When Richard arrived, the nurses became noticeably more deferential, their voices dropping into soft, hushed tones. Richard played his role with terrifying precision, his voice dripping with feigned love and deep, performative sorrow, telling everyone exactly what they expected to hear while she lay trapped in the bed, unable to scream the truth of his cold, calculated deception. "I am right here, Kate. I am not leaving you," he would murmur, his voice a practiced melody of devotion. But his touch was unnervingly ice-cold, and his hand resting on hers felt heavy and dead, like a useless weight. The turning point finally arrived on a gray, late afternoon. She had been drifting, only half aware of the world, when the door to her private room creaked open. She expected a nurse, but the scent that drifted into the room was sharp, acidic, and terrifyingly familiar, a perfume that meant only one thing: trouble. "Jasmine, Vanessa, any change?" Vanessa's voice was a low, clipped whisper that lacked any shred of warmth. "Nothing," Richard replied, his voice a tired, annoyed sigh. "She just lies there like a mannequin, and the damned baby is still fine. According to the doctors, it is like he is thriving in there, despite everything that happened. This is taking far too long." "Richard," Vanessa said, her voice sharp with impatient frustration, "we need this to end soon so we can finally move on with our lives and put this entire messy situation behind us. The police are still circling us, like vultures waiting for a carcass to stop moving. Detective Corian called my office again this afternoon, digging for answers, sniffing around the financials, and poring over our phone records like they were a clear roadmap to a crime. Let them keep digging." Richard snapped earlier, his face a mask of cold, unbothered arrogance. "There is nothing for them to find. We were careful, were we? I lie here in the dark, my mind screaming the questions I dare not speak. What if I wake up? What if I start to remember?" The silence that follows is heavy and suffocating. Catherine strained with every fiber of her being, fighting the exhaustion to force her mind to focus, to absorb every word spoken in the room. "She will not remember," Richard finally said, his voice flat, hollow, and utterly devoid of any real human emotion. And even if she did, who would they believe? A confused, brain-damaged woman who cannot remember her own name. Or the loving, devoted husband who has been by her side every single day. I have laid the groundwork perfectly. The doctors believe me. I have built a fortress of lies that no one can breach. And she is nothing more than a prisoner. Vanessa, the world sees a tragedy, not a crime, her instability. Her sudden, dizzy spells, the reports of her fainting it is my word against the ghosts of what might have happened. He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice dropped into a venomous hiss that made Catherine's blood run cold. But this needs to end. If she does not expire on her own soon, we may need to consider a more permanent, proactive solution. The doctors are already talking about compassionate care. They are practically begging us to stop the suffering. It is time to ensure that they do. It would be so easy to play the part of the grieving husband, to step into the role of a man forced by fate to let his wife go. But the reality was far more jagged and terrifying. A wave of pure, undiluted terror washed over Catherine, so powerful it hit her like a physical blow to the chest. They were talking about murdering her, right here in the safety of her hospital bed. These people were waiting for her to pass away, and if she refused to die on their schedule, they would simply finish the job themselves without a single moment of hesitation. But alongside that cold terror, something else ignited deep within her, a core of raw, focused rage as hot and bright as a furnace. They had tried to kill her. They had tried to take her son away from her forever. And they were planning to get away with it, hiding behind a thick, impenetrable wall of money, influence, and practiced lies. No, that single word was a silent, desperate scream echoing in the hollow chambers of her mind. You will not win this, not today. I will survive this, and I will make you pay for every single thing you have stolen from my life. That burning rage gave her an unexpected, miraculous surge of strength. It acted like a potent fuel, slowly burning away the heavy, artificial fog that had clouded her brain since the fall. With a monumental effort of will that took every single ounce of her dwindling energy, she forced her heavy eyelids to flutter. The overhead hospital light was a searing, white-hot pain, and she instinctively squeezed them shut again. But she tried once more, moving much slower this time, determined to break through the darkness that had held her captive for far too long. The sterile, blinding white ceiling of the hospital room finally swam into focus. She heard a sharp, sudden intake of breath from nearby. She is opening her eyes, a nurse's voice said, sounding full of genuine, unfiltered excitement. She is opening her eyes. Doctor, get the doctor immediately. The room was suddenly filled with frantic, chaotic activity. She felt cool hands touching her skin, a bright light shining into her pupils. The doctor's face appeared above hers, looking kind and smiling. But to her, it looked like a dream she was barely tethered to in this harsh, bright world. Catherine, can you hear me? Squeeze my hand if you can hear me. She felt his steady, warm hand against hers, and she squeezed back a weak, feeble movement that felt like she was lifting a mountain. A wave of relieved chatter rippled through the room. Richard pushed his way to her bedside, his face a perfect, polished mask of astonished, tearful joy. Kate, oh my God, you are back. You are back with me. He reached out to hold her, and she felt the phantom weight of his touch before he even made contact with her skin. But as he drifted into her direct line of sight, the memory of his face at the top of the stairs, the cold, calculated resolve, the cruel, thin smile flashed in her mind with perfect, horrifying clarity. She remembered the push. She remembered everything. The terror returned instantly, and with it, a primal, instinctual cunning took hold. If he knew she remembered, she was already dead, her son was dead, and he would find a way to silence her before the sun set on another day, leaving no trace of the life they had built together. An overdose of morphine, or perhaps a pillow pressed firmly over her face in the dead of night. He had said it himself, and he meant every word. It would be her word against his, and she was currently the one who could not speak. She had exactly one chance, one weapon left in her arsenal. The doctor was speaking to her again. Catherine, do you know where you are? Do you know what happened? She looked at Richard S.'s hopeful, terrified face, then shifted her gaze to the doctor, preparing to deliver the performance of her life to ensure their mutual destruction. She let her eyes glaze over with a look of utter, heartbreaking, and vacant confusion. She opened her mouth, the breathing tube finally gone, her throat raw and aching from the ordeal. Her voice was a dry, raspy whisper that barely scraped the air. Who are you? She asked, her gaze sweeping over Richard as if he were a complete, total stranger. Where am I? I do not remember anything. I do not know where I am or why I am here. It was the only way to play the game he had started, pretending she was a blank slate waiting for his next cruel move. She saw the tiny, microscopic flicker of relief in Richard's eyes, so quick that anyone else would have missed it. But she caught it. It was instantly replaced by a flawless, practiced performance of profound, heavy sadness. He sagged against the rail, putting a trembling hand to his forehead to hide his expression. "Oh, Catherine," he said, his voice cracking with artificial perfection. "It is me, Richard, your husband. You had a terrible, tragic fall at home." It was a beautiful lie, perfectly delivered, and she knew then that she had him exactly where she needed him to be. The doctor put a comforting, heavy hand on Richard's shoulder. "It is not uncommon with this level of head trauma," he explained gently to the room. "Amnesia. It could be temporary, or it could be more extensive depending on the brain healing. We will have to run some more tests to be certain." Catherine lay perfectly still, her heart hammering wildly against her ribs. The game had just changed. She was not a helpless victim anymore. She was a survivor who had just realized that her greatest weapon against this man was the very silence he had forced upon her. She moved through the hospital like a shadow, playing the part of a fragile, broken woman to perfection. Beneath the white hospital sheets, she was no longer the soft, trusting wife Richard thought he had destroyed. Every second spent in that sterile room was a calculated gamble, a performance of amnesia designed to keep her alive. She was hunting for the truth, gathering the pieces of her own survival while protecting the tiny, flickering life growing inside her. They thought she was a blank slate, but she was a steel trap ready to snap shut, waiting only for the moment she could finally drag their rotting secrets into the harsh, unforgiving light of day. The diagnosis of retrograde amnesia was the perfect shield, a masterstroke of irony that Richard himself had nurtured. He played the role of the devoted billionaire husband with sickening precision, showering her with affection while carefully rewriting their history. Every day he brought in thick, curated photo albums, spinning elaborate, sentimental lies about a perfect romance that had never existed. He filled her head with tall tales, painting himself as the hero, unaware that his own narcissism was feeding the very fire that would eventually burn his carefully constructed world to the ground. She sat motionless for hours, trapped in a nightmare where she had to listen to his voice, his lies, and his feigned devotion. It was a brutal, draining performance that tested her sanity every single minute. When he touched her hand, she had to stop herself from flinching, turning her revulsion into a hollow, vacant stare. Every loving word he whispered was a jagged blade against her skin, a constant reminder of the day he pushed her off the edge, all while she played the role of the traumatized, empty vessel he needed her to be. She mastered the art of the pathetic, wide-eyed stare, asking him small, inconsequential questions about their life to keep him smug and comfortable. Did we have a favorite restaurant? Did I ever like the color blue? She would watch the flickers of pride crossing his face, the way he relished his position of total control over her memory. He was so busy admiring his own performance that he never once looked closely enough to see the cold, burning resolve hiding behind her eyes. He thought he was rewriting her history, but he was merely handing her the keys to his undoing. The loneliness was heavy, but Jessica was the one thread holding her to reality. Their first reunion in the hospital was a scene of pure torture. Catherine had to stare at her best friend's tear-filled eyes without a flicker of recognition, all while Richard stood right there, gloating in his dominance. It was an agonizing display of restraint. To protect herself, she had to treat the woman who loved her like a total stranger, letting Richard believe he had successfully stripped her of everyone who mattered, leaving her isolated and utterly vulnerable to his reach. Richard stood by her, his arm draped possessively over her shoulder as if he owned her, introducing Jessica with a patronizing grin. He called her a friend, watching Catherine's face for any spark of memory he could suppress. Catherine forced her eyes to go blank, whispering a soft, rehearsed, "I am sorry, I do not know you." The heartbreak on Jessica's face was almost too much to bear, but she held her ground, hiding her own tears behind a mask of polite confusion, sensing the terrifying reality beneath Catherine's cold, lifeless exterior. Jessica played along, offering light, empty stories about their past. But the moment they leaned in close, The mask slipped. The whisper was soft, barely a breath against Catherine's ear. But the words carried the weight of a vow. I do not believe him. That was the spark Catherine needed to begin the real work. With Richard forced into the hallway for a medical exam, she grabbed a pencil, her hand shaking with a mix of terror and pure adrenaline as she scribbled the truth onto a scrap of paper that would soon ignite their world. She chose her moment carefully, passing the note to Maria, a young nurse who had been ignored by Richard's arrogant, elitist behavior. The message was clear, a frantic call for justice. It revealed everything, the truth of her memory, the reality of the push, and the desperate need for Detective Corian. When Jessica returned the next day, the air in the room felt different. The shift in Jessica's eyes told her everything she needed to know. This message had been delivered, the plan was in motion, and the countdown to Richard's downfall had finally officially begun. While Richard was occupied with a loud, aggressive business call in the corridor, Jessica moved with practiced speed. She slipped a tiny burner phone into Catherine's hand, a lifeline hidden in plain sight. She whispered that Maria was now an ally, ready to cover for her, and that Detective Corian was waiting. The metallic weight of the phone was a physical promise. The isolation was breaking, and for the first time since the fall, Catherine felt the power shifting back into her own hands, ready to be used with surgical, cold precision. That night, wrapped in the shadows of her room with Maria keeping watch, Catherine finally made the call. Her voice was a steady, dangerous whisper as she recounted everything to Detective Corian: the betrayal, the conversations, and the ongoing, lethal deception. On the other end, the detective was silent, his own fury growing as he heard the full scope of the billionaire's cruelty. He had spent months hunting for a break in the case, and now he finally had the one piece of evidence that would guarantee Richard would never walk free again. Detective Corian sounded calm, but there was a sharp, jagged edge to his voice that reassured Catherine. He told her she was doing the impossible, but warned her that the danger was mounting. He wanted them stopped for good, not just for a moment. He needed something concrete, something that showed undeniable intent in black and white. Catherine knew the laptop was the key. He brought it every day, leaving it within her reach, never dreaming the vegetable he had created was capable of dismantling his empire. The detective explained that his lawyers would fight the audio, claiming it was taken out of context or fabricated, so they needed a paper trail of his malice. Catherine looked at the machine on the bedside table. He treated it like his own heart, guarding his business and his secrets there. He believed she was incapable of understanding a simple login screen. She realized he was so arrogant, so utterly blinded by his own sense of superiority, that he had essentially left the door to his own prison unlocked, waiting for her to step through. She whispered the plan to Corian. Wait for the moment Richards stepped away. The challenge was the password, but the detective urged her to think about what drove a man like Richard. His ego was the size of a mountain. Was it his birthday, his company, or perhaps the name of his legacy? He had built his life on his own glory. If she wanted to crack his shell, she had to play to his narcissism. It was a desperate, long shot. But in a world of lies, his vanity was the only honest thing he had. The following afternoon, the timing was perfect. Richard sat by her bed, his fingers flying across the keys of his silver laptop, fully engrossed in his own schemes. When a physical therapy specialist arrived, Richard stepped out to take a call, leaving the screen glowing in the dim light. Catherine felt her heart hammering against her ribs. This was the moment of no return. She leaned forward, the weight of her unborn child's future resting on these next few critical seconds of silence. Her hands were trembling so violently, she had to force them to be still. She stared at the login screen, thinking about his insatiable, bottomless vanity. She typed in the name of the hedge fund he obsessed over constantly, the one he boasted about to anyone who would listen: Sterling Alpha. The cursor blinked for a heartbeat, agonizing and long, before the screen finally unlocked. She was in. The thrill of it was like a sudden rush of oxygen in a room where she had been slowly suffocating for weeks. Time seemed to freeze as she scanned the desktop. She didn't waste a second on his boring, meaningless business files. She went straight for the web browser, driven by Corian's instructions. Her blood turned to ice as the search history unfolded before her eyes. It was a digital map of a murder, a clinical, step-by-step documentation of his plan to silence her. He hadn't just tried to kill her once. He was actively refining his methods, making sure he would finish the job he had started. The entries were a chilling testament to his psychopathy: how to override life support, the exact dosage of lethal chemicals, and legal inquiries about how to void a will if a spouse was incapacitated. It was all there, laid bare in the bright, clinical light of the screen. He was hunting for the perfect way to finish her off while he remained untouched. A untouchable billionaire preparing to scrub his conscience clean. Every click of her finger was a step toward his destruction, and he never even knew it was happening. She had to work fast, her hands shaking as she pulled out the tiny, thin burner phone and began photographing his history. Each flash was a potential alarm. But she didn't stop. She dug deeper into his cloud storage, finding an encrypted folder labeled contingency. Naturally, he used the same arrogant password. The ease of it made her skin crawl, but it was exactly what she needed. She was documenting his darkest thoughts, building the case that would bury him, all while sitting inches away from him. Inside the contingency folder lay a file that made her chest tighten. She clicked play on an audio recording, keeping the volume turned down so low only she could hear. It was Vanessa's voice, cold and sharp, warning him about his sloppiness. He had been recording his own accomplice. Even when they were planning to kill a woman, they didn't trust each other. He was keeping an insurance policy, a secret archive of their shared crimes, proving that the man she had loved was a monster who trusted no one at all. The audio was definitive proof of the conspiracy, a clear record of funds being moved offshore in preparation for their escape. He was preparing for everything, thinking he had covered every angle, but he had forgotten the person he had hurt the most. Catherine sent the files to Detective Corian, her breath hitching as the progress bar climbed to 100%. The second the transfer was complete, she heard the heavy, familiar thud of his footsteps returning to the room, sharp and confident. She ditched the phone, pulled the blanket up, and slacked her jaw, instantly returning to the role of the vacant victim. Richard walked in, eyes sweeping over the laptop as if checking for any signs of tampering. For one eternal second, the air felt like it was screaming. He looked right at her, searching for anything, but saw only the woman he believed he had shattered. His own arrogance had left him blind. He was looking at his own judge and jury, but all he saw was his quiet, helpless prize. He smiled that condescending, familiar smile, closing the laptop and telling her to rest. He promised her that everything would be taken care of soon. She closed her eyes, hiding the tears of fire and the promise she made to her baby. Yes, Richard, it certainly would be. Across the city, Detective Corian opened the email, the cold, clinical evidence of a billionaire's depravity staring back at him. The game had reached its end, and the hunter had finally become the one being hunted. The digital breadcrumbs left behind were nothing short of a full confession. That audio file of Vanessa Croft was the final nail in the coffin, detailing every twisted move with chilling clarity. It was premeditated, cold, and utterly ruthless, all documented in black and white. There would be no high-priced legal team capable of wriggling them out of this nightmare. He quickly assembled his elite investigative unit. "It is time," he announced, his voice vibrating with grim authority. "We are taking them both down right now." There was absolutely no room left for doubt, hesitation, or second chances. The tactical plan was executed with swift, surgical precision. One team of seasoned detectives was immediately dispatched to the sterile, high-rise Sterling Capital headquarters in Midtown to apprehend Vanessa Croft. Another team, led personally by Corin, headed toward the New York Presbyterian Hospital. Vanessa was currently positioned in a glass-walled boardroom, leading a high-stakes, multi-million-dollar meeting when the detectives barged in, their aggressive presence shattering the pristine, expensive, and artificial silence of the corporate environment that Vanessa had spent her entire career trying to conquer. She looked up from the mahogany table, her usual expression of calculated annoyance quickly morphing into one of pure, unadulterated shock the moment she locked eyes with the police badges. "Vanessa Croft," one of the lead detectives asked, his voice booming across the suddenly silent, frozen room. "You are officially under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder and attempted murder." The color drained from her face as if a plug had been pulled. Her mask of cool, corporate superiority shattered entirely, instantly replaced by raw, frantic panic. "This is all completely absurd," she stammered, though her eyes betrayed the truth. "You have absolutely no idea who you are dealing with," she snarled, her voice trembling as they cuffed her shaking hands behind her back. But as she was led away through the stunned, whispering silence of her former colleagues, Her eyes betrayed a dawning, sickening horror. Richard had failed. He had not silenced Catherine, and now they were both going down in flames. At the hospital, Corin wanted to handle Richard himself, personally ensuring the man saw exactly who was responsible for ending his reign of terror once and for all. He entered the hushed intensive care unit ward, flanked by two armed, uniformed officers, and found Richard right where he expected him to be, looming over Catherine's bedside, holding her hand, putting on a sickening display of devotion. A nurse was quietly checking Catherine's vitals nearby, completely oblivious to the massive storm about to break in this room. "Mr. Sterling," Corin said, his voice terrifyingly calm and even. Richard looked up, forcing a weary, perfectly practiced smile that didn't reach his cold eyes. "Detective, any news?" Richard asked, his voice dripping with faux concern. "As a matter of fact, yes," Corin said, stepping closer to the white hospital bed. "Richard Sterling, you are under arrest for the attempted murder of your wife, Catherine Sterling, and your own unborn child." Richard's smile froze instantly. He laughed a short, incredulous, and nervous bark. "You cannot be serious. On what grounds? My wife suffered a tragic accident. We know about the push, Richard," Corin stated firmly, his eyes locked onto the man's face. Corin continued, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl that cut through the air. "We know about the prenup. We know about your specific internet research into potassium chloride dosages. And we know about your entire sick contingency plan." As Corin spoke, he saw Richard's eyes dart nervously toward Catherine. He saw the flicker of confusion, the dawning realization that he had been played from the very start. And then he looked back at Corin with pure, undiluted hatred, the arrogant mask finally slipping off his face. At that exact moment, Catherine's eyes, which had been vacant and glazed for weeks, slowly focused with newfound clarity. They moved from the detective to the man currently holding her hand. Her expression shifted from dazed confusion to one of clear, profound recognition and absolute terror. "You," she whispered, her voice weak but cutting through the silence like a blade. She yanked her hand away from his as if it had been burned by fire. "You pushed me," the nurse gasped, dropping her medical chart in pure shock as the horrific reality took hold. The uniformed officer stepped forward, ready to intervene. Richard stared at his wife, his face a grotesque mask of disbelief and blinding fury. The amnesia had been a trick all along. The fragile, broken victim was just a carefully crafted lie. He had been living in a golden cage with a predator and never even suspected it. He lunged not for the door, but for Catherine, a final, desperate act of violence. "You lying bitch," he roared, his true dark self fully exposed for everyone in the room to witness. But Corin was much faster than him. He intercepted Richard, slamming him back against the cold wall with a force that knocked every bit of breath from his lungs. The officers swarmed, wrenching his arms behind his back and snapping the cold steel of the handcuffs around his wrists with a satisfying click. "It is over, Sterling," Corin growled in his ear as they dragged him, struggling and cursing profanities, from the room. The fight had finally drained out of him, replaced by the terrifying, looming reality of his life in a prison cell. Richard's eyes locked with Catherine's one last time as he was dragged away. He saw no fear in her gaze anymore, only a cold, hard strength he had never known she possessed. She had beaten him at his own game. In the weeks that followed, the story exploded across every news outlet. The tale of the wealthy millionaire, the conniving mistress, and the quiet wife who outsmarted them both was on every television screen, capturing the public's collective imagination and revealing the deep, disgusting rot behind their glamorous, high society facade. Faced with the insurmountable mountain of evidence and Catherine's impending testimony, Vanessa Croft's icy resolve finally crumbled. In exchange for a slightly lesser sentence, she confessed to every detail, explaining Richard's entire plan from the very beginning. She painted him as the manipulative, dangerous monster he truly was, and in doing so, she permanently sealed his fate. 3 weeks later, Catherine gave birth to a healthy, beautiful baby boy, a precious symbol of her new beginning and the life she fought so hard to save. She named him Andrew, a name meaning strong and brave, holding him in her arms in the quiet, sanctuary-like peace of her hospital room, far away from the invasive media circus. She felt a profound peace she had not known in years. She had walked through fire and emerged not just as a survivor, but as a warrior. She had saved herself, and she had saved her son. The gilded, suffocating cage was gone, and in its place was the terrifying, beautiful, and boundless freedom of a future she would finally build on her own terms. The massive sterling fortune, now tied up in messy, endless legal battles, did not matter anymore. She had the only thing of true value in this world: her son, her own life, and her newly discovered strength. In the end, Richard Sterling, the once feared titan of Wall Street, was sentenced to life in prison without the slightest possibility of parole. His empire crumbled, his name becoming a literal byword for greed, narcissism, and cruelty in the corporate world, ensuring he would be remembered for all the wrong reasons. Vanessa Croft, his primary co-conspirator, received a lengthy 25-year sentence, her unchecked ambition ultimately leading her to a cold, isolated, and concrete prison cell. But this story is not just about their inevitable downfall. It is about the truly incredible, bone-deep resilience of Catherine Sterling, a woman who was pushed broken and left for dead, but who refused to remain a victim. She used her attacker's own arrogance against him, turning her lonely hospital bed into a command center for long-awaited justice. Her story stands as a truly powerful reminder that the greatest kind of strength is often forged in our absolute darkest, most painful moments, and that real courage does not always roar like a storm. Sometimes it is just a quiet, steady whisper in the dark, a silent vow to keep holding on until you finally see the sunrise. If Catherine's incredible story of survival, resilience, and final justice moved you, please take a moment to hit that like button to show your support for her long, grueling journey. Share this video with someone who might really need a reminder of the indomitable power of the human spirit when things get tough. And please do not forget to subscribe to our channel for more real, true stories that will likely leave you breathless. Click that notification bell so you never miss a single update on our latest investigations and deep dives into survivor stories. We are committed to bringing you these narratives because every single voice deserves to be heard, and every truth deserves to come to light.